Welcome to the digital intellect. The news broke like a dam bursting, sudden, unstoppable, and impossible to ignore. In a matter of minutes, the story swept across every television, radio, and phone in the country, shattering the routine of daily life. Egypt, a nation built on the banks of the Nile, had done the unthinkable. Egypt shuts off the Nile. The mighty river, which had flowed for millennia, was halted at its source. The Aswan High Dam's gates, symbols of progress and power, now stood as barriers, holding back the water that had always been Egypt's birthright. Cafes in Cairo fell silent, the usual clatter of cups and conversation replaced by a stunned hush. In Alexandria, notifications buzzed and screens lit up, but no one seemed to know what to say. Disbelief and confusion spread like wildfire, uniting cities and villages in a shared moment of shock. The Nile was Egypt's lifeblood. To shut it off was unthinkable. For centuries, its waters had nourished fields, filled homes, and inspired poets. The river was more than geography, it was identity, history, and hope. Yet, live footage showed the Aswan High Dam's gates sealed, the river reduced to a trickle, then nothing. The familiar rush of water was gone, replaced by the stark image of dry concrete and stillness. An eerie silence replaced the river's roar. The absence of water was more than physical, it was a silence that echoed in the hearts of millions, a void where life had always flowed. Across villages people emerged, drawn to the banks by a primal fear. Generations had depended on the Nile, and now, faced with its absence, they gathered in anxious clusters, searching for answers in the empty riverbed. The air was heavy with dread. Every face reflected the same question: what would happen now? The uncertainty was as thick as the summer heat, pressing down on every street and home. Panic spread, phone lines jammed, families desperate for answers. In living rooms and crowded call centers, people clung to radios and phones, hoping for news, for reassurance, for any sign that this nightmare would end. In Luxor, tour guides stared at still waters. Their boats, once bustling with tourists, now sat idle. Fishermen in the delta pulled up empty nets, their livelihoods vanishing with the receding water. The impact was immediate and devastating. This was no distant crisis, it was an existential threat, felt in every home and field. Crops withered, livestock grew restless, and families watched the horizon with growing fear, knowing that their future was suddenly uncertain. The world reacted with stunned disbelief. Newsrooms from London to Beijing scrambled to cover the unfolding crisis, their anchors struggling to convey the magnitude of what was happening. International news ran non-stop coverage, diplomats scrambled for information. Governments convened emergency meetings, analysts debated the consequences, and the world's attention turned to Egypt. Leaders in Sudan and Ethiopia demanded answers. The Nile was not just Egypt's river, it was the lifeline of an entire region, and its closure sent shockwaves through neighboring countries. Was this protest, catastrophe, or something worse? Experts argued on live television, headlines screamed of disaster, and rumors swirled on social media, fueling anxiety and speculation. The Nile's closure was a geopolitical earthquake, threatening conflict over water. The stakes were nothing less than survival, and the world watched as tensions mounted. Shockwaves rippled across Africa and the Middle East. From the Horn of Africa to the Mediterranean, leaders and citizens alike wondered what the future would hold. Egypt's lifeblood was cut off at the source. The river that had shaped civilizations was now a memory, its absence a wound felt by millions. The world held its breath, waiting for what would come next. In homes, offices, and public squares, people watched and waited, united by uncertainty and fear. The river that defined a nation had been silenced. Its absence was a reminder of how fragile even the most enduring things can be. Egypt stood on the edge of the unknown. As dawn broke over a silent river, a nation waited, its fate and perhaps the fate of a region hanging in the balance. In the bustling markets of Aswan, what began as hushed whispers among vendors and shoppers quickly swelled into a tidal wave of panic. The air, usually filled with the sounds of bargaining and laughter, now crackled with fear and uncertainty. News spread like wildfire. An order had come from the highest authorities. The dam's gates were closed. Headlines screamed of crisis, and television broadcasts interrupted daily routines with urgent updates. On every street corner, people gathered in tight circles, voices trembling as they tried to make sense of the unfolding disaster. Some dismissed it as a temporary test, a measure that would soon be reversed. Others feared the worst, calling it a catastrophe in the making. But no matter their opinions, everyone agreed on one thing: the water had stopped, and life as they knew it was changing. In Cairo, a city famous for its relentless energy and constant motion, the usual chaos faded. Streets that once overflowed with honking cars and shouting vendors now lay eerily quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Cafes and living rooms filled with anxious crowds, all eyes glued to television screens. Faces were illuminated by the glow of impossible headlines, each update deepening the sense of dread. In the fertile delta, farmers who had relied on the Nile for generations stood helplessly by their shrinking canals. They watched the water recede, knowing that without it, their crops and their livelihoods would soon wither and die. The land's veins, once pulsing with life, were drying up. Cracks spread across the earth like scars, marking the beginning of a crisis that threatened to unravel the fabric of rural life. As dusk settled over the country, people from every walk of life, city dwellers and villagers alike, made their way to the banks of the Nile. They gathered in silence, drawn by a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a desperate need to see the river for themselves. They did not come to celebrate, but to bear witness to the unimaginable. The river that had given Egypt life for millennia now lay still, its currents vanished. The surface of the Nile was glassy and motionless, reflecting the fading light of the sky. The familiar, comforting sound of flowing water was gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. Along the riverbanks, the gentle lapping of water had been replaced by a heavy, haunting quiet. The absence of movement was unsettling, as if time itself had stopped. Families stood together in shock, their faces etched with horror and sorrow. The Nile, the heart of their nation, was becoming a ghost before their very eyes. For many, it felt as if the mother of their nation was dying. Tears flowed freely as people mourned not just a river, but a way of life that had endured for thousands of years. Fear and disbelief gripped the country from Aswan to Alexandria. In every city and village, anxiety hung in the air, uniting millions in a shared sense of loss and uncertainty. The river's absence was more than a crisis. It was a wound that would not heal, a scar on the land and the hearts of its people. Egypt watched, helpless, as the lifeblood of their nation slipped away. The silence was the most shocking part. The Nile's sounds, roaring cataracts, boat engines, laughter were gone. Fishermen's boats stranded in mud, the river's ecosystem falling silent. The transformation was brutal. Muddy banks cracked, ancient debris surfaced. Remaining water grew stagnant, the river a still pond. Wildlife suffered, birds circled in confusion, fish gasped in shrinking pools. The green ribbon of life turned brown under the sun. This was more than ecological disaster, it was psychological. Egyptians' identity was tied to the flowing Nile. On Cairo's bridges, people stared at the listless water, silent. The nation's soul seemed to evaporate with the river. Fear and uncertainty filled the void. Time itself felt as if it had stopped. After a day of chaos and swirling rumors, the government finally broke its silence. The entire nation seemed to hold its breath, waiting for answers as uncertainty gripped every household. The president, his face set in grim determination, appeared on every screen. He confirmed the unthinkable. By direct order, the mighty Aswan Dam had been closed. The Nile, Egypt's lifeblood, was now under lock and key. This was no accident. It was a calculated act, a bold message to the world, a declaration that Egypt would defend its rights to the Nile at any cost. The government wanted everyone to know, Egypt would not be bullied or ignored. The president insisted the closure was only temporary, a demonstration of what others threatened to impose on Egypt. He spoke of national dignity, of standing tall in the face of foreign pressure. He appealed for unity, trust, and sacrifice, promising swift emergency measures to protect the people. But as his words echoed through the airwaves, fear and doubt crept into every corner. The promise of reassurance was quickly overshadowed by anxiety. On the streets, reactions were mixed. Some cheered Egypt's defiance, waving flags and chanting in support. Others, however, saw only disaster looming, their faces etched with worry as they debated what the future might hold. "It is our river," some shouted with pride, but many more whispered their fears, wondering how long they could survive if the water stopped flowing. Almost immediately, water rationing began. The military was deployed to guard vital infrastructure, and public taps ran dry as the government scrambled to maintain order. The government's gamble was now on the table for all to see. The stakes could not be higher. Egypt's future hung in the balance. Had Egypt taken a bold step to secure its destiny, or had it set itself on a path toward disaster? The question haunted every conversation, every silent glance at the river. Across the country, families braced for the unknown. People rushed to stock up on water and supplies, preparing for a crisis that felt both immediate and unimaginable. The Nile, usually a symbol of life and movement, now lay eerily still. The silence of the river mirrored the tension in the air, as if the land itself was waiting for what would come next. Was this the true price of sovereignty, a necessary stand for national pride, or was it the beginning of a catastrophe that would change Egypt forever? Only time would tell, as the nation stood on the edge of an uncertain future. The Nile is not just a river, it is Egypt's soul. For millennia, its floods created life in the desert, shaping civilization. Over 95% of Egyptians live along its banks, relying on its water for everything. The river powers farms, industries, and daily life. It is celebrated in culture, woven into identity. To see it still was to see Egypt's heart stop. The government's decision was more than political. It was a spiritual trauma. The people's fear ran deeper than thirst. It was existential. If the Nile could be stopped, what else could vanish? Egypt's drastic move was the climax of a decade-long standoff with Ethiopia. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Africa's largest, promised power for Ethiopia but threatened Egypt's water. Egypt feared the dam's reservoir would choke the Nile's flow. Years of failed negotiations bred mistrust and anger. Ethiopia saw the dam as its right. Egypt saw it as a threat to survival. Talks stalled over water guarantees and sovereignty. As Ethiopia prepared to fill the dam, Egypt's desperation peaked. Closing the Aswan Dam was a last dangerous move in a bitter chess game. Egypt's action turned a national crisis into a global emergency. Sudan was caught in the middle, fearing for its own water and stability. Ethiopia condemned Egypt's move. Nationalism surged. Militaries mobilized. The world watched as two giants teetered on the brink of war over water. The UN and African Union scrambled to mediate. A conflict would devastate the region, disrupt global trade, and spark a refugee crisis. Food prices soared, aid groups braced for disaster. The Nile crisis was now a warning to the world. Water wars were no longer a distant threat. They were here. The fate of millions hung in the balance. Days of tension forced a breakthrough. Egypt reopened the Aswan Dam. An emergency agreement brokered by the African Union and UN averted disaster. Water surged back, hope returned, but the crisis left scars. The region awoke to the reality of water scarcity. Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan signed a binding framework for the dam's operation. New investments in desalination and conservation began. The Nile could no longer be taken for granted. The crisis was a warning and a lesson in cooperation. The river connects nations, it should not divide them. The future depends on open dialogue, not closed gates. Only unity can keep the Nile and its people alive.